Okay, we'd like to go ahead and call to order. This is the Budget and Finance Committee, the Treasurer's report, where we will receive an update as it relates to our annual debt. We're going to go ahead and have our financial advisor come on down. So we can receive our update. Yeah, we already have it up for you. This is the meeting for our treasurer's report. And just for the viewing audience, if you can go ahead and state your name, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Tom Edelman, Metro Treasurer. With me tonight is Wayne Plessy from Hilltop Securities. He is the Managing Director and our Financial Advisor. Heidi Gould is a Debt Administrator in the office. In the back, we have Jeff Oldham and Lillian Blackshear from Basperi & Sims. They are our bond counsel. And Talia had to leave early tonight to attend the graduation, but Kim and Jean are here to help us answer any questions that we need help on. So anyway, we'll jump right into the report, and these are the 4 areas that we're going to talk about tonight. There's a lot of slides here, but we wanted to make sure you had all the information you needed as we look at the debt. You should have received on May 1st, the same day as the filing of the budget with you, a copy of the report to council, so you should have that available. The next several slides, we'll just hit some of the main points in the council report, in the debt report to council. For the general obligation debt, our bonded debt is $2.5 billion. If you include the interest, it's about $3.5 billion. We have some state loans for the schools. And then our commercial paper program, we currently have $600 million outstanding of commercial paper. We did receive a question before the meeting that talked about the debt service schedules and the level debt service that we try to obtain. This slide, I know it's hard to see, and you'll get a copy of this after the presentation, but each of the individual outstanding bonds, the debt service schedule for those bonds are shown here. The goal of debt service is to have level decreasing debt service payments. And the new bonds that we issue for the new money are generally level debt service. There have been a couple of instances in the past where we have done not level debt service, but an attempt to wrap our new debt around the existing debt. So in total, it tries to reach a level debt service on an annual basis. If you look on the far right, you'll see that our debt service in aggregate is a fairly level declining debt service that we're looking for. There are 2 years in FY22 and 23 where they do drop a little bit in those years and then come right back to where they were before and then start dropping off after that. So just a couple of things on level debt service. Starting in 2014, the state passed new requirements that there will be level debt service. There will be no more of the wrapping like we had before unless you get prior approval of the state. So if you're looking back over these bonds, in 2013 and 2010, those bond issues were actually the ones involved in here that were not level debt but have some of that wrapping impact around. According to the state rules, now we have to go to the state to ask their permission to do that. We haven't done that with the 2015 issue, and we don't plan to do that going forward unless there is particular reasons that we want to do that. So that process of wrapping debt and not generating level debt service is kind of something that won't happen anymore. The next slide is just a visual of that previous slide. So it shows the different bond issues and the ones falling off as we move forward, and the other ones, especially the 2010s, where they start ramping up as those older ones fall off, so we keep kind of our level debt service. Moving on, the water and sewer outstanding debt is a total of about 1.5, principal and interest 1.6. They also have a commercial paper program and have 125 million outstanding of commercial paper. The water department did issue a bond this year. It was the first ever green bond that was issued in the state, the first for the city of Nashville. It was about 90 million par amount for the green bonds. We had an excellent sale. The water department bonds oftentimes are longer lived bonds because the projects are longer term bonds. So this was a 30-year maturity. We received the highest rating from Moody's on green bonds that's available. And actually during this rating process, our water and sewer regular revenue bonds were upgraded by S&P from AA- to AA. Other revenue debt outstanding is Convention Center and Sports Authority, $1.2 billion for the Convention Center and $198 million for the Sports Authority. Another part of the debt report is a section called contingent liability. And what this represents are those bonds that have been issued, revenue bonds, and these are Sports Authority and the Convention Center Authority, where at the time of issue, Metro pledged some non-tax revenues to these bonds to provide more security for the bonds. So the non-tax revenue for the GSD is pledged to about a $1.1 billion of those bonds, but the pledge is for annual debt service. So the annual debt service for the GSD bonds for FY18, those that were backed by the non-tax revenue pledge, was $56 million. And to support that, there was $178 million of non-tax revenues received for FY18, or projected to be received. For the USD non-tax revenue, the debt service that's backed by that for FY18 was $7 million, and about $20 million was received or projected to be received for the non-tax revenues. I mentioned commercial paper a couple times. Just a refresher, commercial paper is a bond anticipation note, and it is used to do short-term funding of our long-term approved projects. So on a short-term basis, we can build the project, do some financing of the projects over a not to exceed 6-year process. But what it does, it allows us to finance those projects that have been approved. It doesn't authorize any new projects, only those that have been approved. Short-term financing, lower cost until we actually do the long-term bond issue. Interest rates for this year on our short-term bonds range from about 0.8% to about 2%. Right now they're running a little bit lower. They're variable rate notes, and they mature roughly 60 to 90 days, most of them. So the rates that we receive on those are quite a bit less than once we go to the long-term market, which is roughly about 3.6% right now. The second bullet there, we just issued another $25 million in water and sewer bonds, or water and sewer CP. So this number did not get updated after we did that, but there's $125 million of water and sewer out of a $300 million program, and there's $600 million outstanding of a $700 million GO program. I'm going to turn it over to Wayne. He's going to talk a little bit about the rating agencies, our ratings, and how we compare to other cities and how we're judged versus other cities.
Thank you, Tom. If I could, the next slide, please. This slide shows you the various ratings that are available for entities such as yourself. There are three major rating agencies: Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. We actually use Moody's and S&P, and the ratings are categories, as you can see, varies from AAA down to Baa3. And anything below Baa3 or BBB is considered non-investment grade, and it's generally very expensive to sell, and generally are not available for institutional investors such as bond funds who are major purchasers of bonds. The next slide shows your current ratings. And again, your ratings are by Moody's and S&P. Your general obligation bonds are AA2 and AA by S&P, and both have what is called a stable outlook. And just speaking to outlook and just what that means is, it means that your rating is you have a AA rating, AA2, AA S&P rating, and at this point there is no concern about that rating remaining at that level. If there was concern about that rating or something, they were concerned about the financing or of the city, the rating would have a negative outlook, which means that the rating could change. The other ratings are the water and sewer, which is AA3 and AA. As was mentioned by Tom, the last transaction we did last year, you actually got an upgrade by S&P for your water and sewer, which was a AA minus to AA. The convention center is rated AA2 by Moody's and A by S&P. The sports authority is AA3 by Moody's and AA minus by S&P. And the commercial paper has a different rating. It's called a short-term rating. And the highest rating is P1 and A1 plus, and you have that on both of your programs, the water and sewer as well as the GO. The next slide is just a summary of the most recent rating reports we received. And the first one is from Moody's, and this is on your GO. And the rating is generally rated very highly, and that's mainly because of your diverse, strong economy, and also reflects strong management, which means good financial policies and practices and strong financial management as well. The rating did state a couple things. One, financial support for the hospital as a challenge. Also, the fact that you have a limitation on your tax rate of 4.69, which was instituted in 2006. Fortunately, you're far below that, so you're not approaching that limit, so that has not been a major problem. And then the other is your average debt burden. The other thing that the rating report generally mention is factors that could affect the rating. Factors that could improve the rating would be an increase in reserve levels, sizable growth in the metro tax base, eliminating of any support for the, or reducing the significant support for the hospital. Factors that could negatively impact your rating, decline in metro fund cash balances. And just speaking to that as a point, the rating agency look at your cash balance as a protection in the event of unforeseeable events with respect to your budgets. And so it's kind of a reserve to address any unforeseen emergency that could arise, and is a means of addressing that. The next slide is for S&P. And it sort of summarizes the same sort of issues that you receive very strong consideration because of the strength of the economy. I mean, it's a diverse, strong economy, and that's a plus. Strong management, again, the management of the city, you have good policies that are implemented, strong financial management. And good budget performance is also a plus. And then just going to the, again, the scenarios that could lead to a change in the rating or a downgrade. Significant deterioration in budgetary flexibility and performance. And flexibility, again, is defined as your liquidity and your fund balance that's available to address any unforeseen emergencies. The next slide is just kind of a summary of the criteria that's used by the rating agencies, Moody's and S&P, in evaluating you and ultimately coming up with a rating. You can see that the economy, for Moody's, the economy is like 30%. Financing, the fund balances is at 30%. Management is 20%. Your debt and pension liability is 20%. For S&P, again, it's 10% the institutional framework. The economy is 30%. Management is 20%. Financing is 30%. And budgetary is like 10%. The next slide is just sort of a comparison of how your rating, particularly your GO, compare to other cities. And you can see you're AA2, AA, and you can see that relative to Austin, Charlotte, who are AA or AAA, and then Louisville, Jefferson County is AA1, AA plus. Portland is a AAA, and then they're not rated by S&P. One of the things that I continuously remind our rating agency of is that you are different from most cities in that you are a city, a county, and a school district. As a result, your debt profile and your operations are a lot different than just a city. And so I remind them of that relative to the level of debt you have, because you're funding a lot more than a lot of cities are. And so that's something I'm constantly reminding them of. The next slide shows a comparison of your debt service as a percent of your operating expenditures. Your, Metro Nashville is the dotted blue line, and you can see that you are generally below 10%, which is good. A lot of the other issues are above that, such as Albuquerque, Memphis, Fort Worth, San Diego. The last couple slides is just a comparison of how you compare to the top 50 large U.S. cities. And again, keeping in mind that you're different in that you are a county, city, and a school district, so you're somewhat different. But you compare favorably. The next slide show what the median is for various cities. And you can see average population is about 66,000. Direct debt about 1.1 billion. Direct debt is about 1.5. And you can see how that compares. Relative to how you, as something was spoke to earlier by Tom, in terms of how fast you retire your debt, and that's over the first 10 years, and that's by doing a level debt, as generally about 68% of the debt is retired the first 10 years. I think yours is like about 66, which is not bad. I think that concludes my comments.
And now we're going to talk a little bit about the debt management policy, looking at the state requirements, Metro's policy, and some of the highlights that's in the policy. The State Funding Board several years ago set out a statement of debt management, including these principles here: the understanding of the transaction, explaining to citizens what's being considered, avoid conflict of interest, and disclose cost and risk. So these are the overriding state elements within a strong financial management. The state requirements also required that municipalities and cities, counties, local governments adopt their own debt policy. Metro's had one for several years. We had one in 2011 that we adopted, and we've updated that recently. If you look on the next page, the council last year adopted a bill that strengthened Metro's debt management policy. That was passed BL 2017-949. Following the passage of that, we have adopted or prepared a new debt policy, an updated debt policy that was adopted by council on December 6th of 2017. And every debt obligation that we've had since 2012, we filed, the council has seen the debt obligation report, and we filed with the state that obligation report. Some of the highlights of our policy, we document the responsibility of oversight and management of the debt. We've defined the criteria. You see the various things that we use here, but basically it sets a framework for how we manage the debt of the government. A couple more of the highlights. The strong preference is for competitive sales of our bonds. Debt financing no longer than the average useful life of the projects being financed. And then free funding, we require savings of 3.5%, generally 3.5% savings on the refundings. What the policy also did this year was lay out some metrics and measures that will be considered as capital spending plans are developed, because remember that capital spending plans are the authorization to go out and spend money and to incur debt. So the capital spending plan, the resolution that the council passes, is the authorization to issue debt. So that's the time when decisions have to be made on what kind of debt you want to incur. So we've got a list of multiple measures and metrics here, and I've included them in the presentation. So those are the next several slides. We'll walk through any of those that we need to come back to, we can, but the first one is general debt service as the annual general expense, and that was one that Wayne mentioned earlier, where we're at about 9%. That looks a little bit different than what you hear in the budget presentation, where it says debt service as a percentage of the budget. That's a little bit different number than what we're looking at here. This is a number that we've tried to use, especially in the comparison with other cities, because that is what the rating agencies look at. So it's a little bit different, and it includes principal and interest only. The one that we looked at in the budget is principal and interest and the total debt service budget. So it's a little bit different, but this is the one that's used to compare against other municipalities. The next slide is the debt as a percentage of taxable property, net debt versus compared to assessed value. Our per capita debt number is next. We're at about $4,380 per capita for our debt. Debt as a percentage of personal income is the next slide. And then the 5-year history of unassigned general obligation fund balance. These are actuals, except for 18 is where we estimate it to be prior to the 19 budget passing. So all of these are metrics, again, that should be used, should be considered as we go through authorizing our new debt. General revenue balances, general expense balances are the next two. Another area that we're looking at that we just want to make sure is being considered is the pension plan funding position. This is provided by Finley, who used to be BPS&M, our actuaries. One of the things that at the top there, just this year, Metro is looking at lowering its discount rate from 7.5% to 7.25%. Benefit Board voted on that earlier this year. And for comparison purposes, where the 100 largest public sector plans, and that's everything from states to cities to counties, the average funded ratio is 70.7%. Metro is current, as of this date, which was FY16, was 96% funded. So our plan is well funded. If you look at the next slide, it shows a 27-year history of the funding rates as well. So the final slide in this section is the OPEB liability. It's at the end of FY17, it was $2.3 billion. So that shows the trajectory over the last 5 years of the OPEB liability. Other economic factors, these are not necessarily in the budget ordinance, but this is information that we also pass on to the rating agencies, share with them some highlights and comparisons, or some information related to the economics. And as Wayne said, the rating agencies that's one of the high points of Metro's rating, is our strong economy. So our population growth shows it's steadily inclining, or steadily increasing since 2010. Unemployment rate is steadily decreasing since 2010. The 2018 number is estimated, or preliminary number, of 2.8% unemployment. Personal income has been rising since 2013. And then finally, some of the highlights of our business comings and provided by the Chamber of Commerce relocations and expansions. So the MSA is on top because as the hub of the MSA, the rating agencies consider that as well as just the Davidson County numbers. Building permits showed a tremendous trend since 2011, a little bit decrease in 2017, but that's still at historic levels for both building permits and the value of the building permits. Next, we're going to look a little bit at the debt service history. If you look at debt service as percentage of the operating budget, this is the number that you're familiar with in the budget presentation. So you can see we, moved from 12.72% last year to a 13.12% for FY19 operating budget. As Wayne mentioned, one of the things that's looked at and compared is how fast we're paying off our existing debt. So our debt in 10 years is about 66.5% paid off in 10 years. And, that's that's the principal repayment, not the total debt, but the principal repayment. So we're in a good position there. General obligation principal balance shows a steady increase. And if you notice on the right-hand side, this includes general obligation bonds and commercial paper. I may mention it here a little bit later, but just for context, since in this fiscal year, we've been spending a little over $39 million a month on capital spending. So this is spending down our authorized projects, but we're spending that. Most of that increase is in commercial paper. I mean, it's all in commercial paper. The last time we issued bonds was 2015, with $600 million outstanding of commercial paper. That's what represents that continued increase there on the GO obligation. Water and sewer principal balance, the 17 increase, again, they issue commercial paper. So even though we haven't seen bonds being issued, the number is rising because of the commercial paper spending along with the bonds that are outstanding. Convention Center was level, no principal were paid on that for a few years. You start seeing in 17 principal payments beginning to be made on the Convention Center debt. Sports Authority, declining debt. We haven't issued new debt for them since 2013, so their bonds their principal outstanding is decreasing. This is a 5-year history of unassigned debt service fund balances, just the dollar amounts associated with that. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about capital spending and debt capacity. The capital spending plans are the resolutions passed by council that become the initial resolutions determining the issue general obligation bonds. That's a requirement in state law that every bond issue be authorized by the legislative body of the local government. So when you pass a capital spending plan, that becomes the bond authorization for everything that's in that capital spending plan. The prior council approved capital spending plans total $3.3 billion. This is since 2009. Bonds issued since that time are $1.6 billion. So we have an authorized unissued amount of bonds of $1.675 billion. This is the basis for the $600 million that we've spent in commercial paper that will be bonding out sometime in later on this year. Commercial paper is used only to finance those projects that have already been approved. The like I mentioned before, the FY18 capital spending is a little over $39 million a month. Based on that spending level, and we've already got $600 million outstanding, we plan to issue $775 million of bonds later this year. That number is bigger than our authorization of $700 million. The idea is that we will get some additional proceeds up front at the current bond rate and use those proceeds for the next few months. As spending at $40 million a month, it's not going to take long to use the extra money that we get. So we're planning to take out $650 million of commercial paper. We will have spent more than we will have drawn our whole $700 million by the time we issue the bonds. So we expect to retire $650 million, get an extra $125 million. So that'll last 4 months before we have to get back into issuing commercial paper again. And of course, future capital spending plans or the pace of spending will impact when those bonds are issued. The next slide shows, based on that previous projection of capital spending or bond issues this year, and then taking out in 2020 and 2023 to consider funding the remainder of the authorized bonds already. This shows what the debt service schedule would look like to fund those outstanding authorizations. And the next slide is just a graphic presentation of that. A couple of points to remember: debt capacity is the ability to fund future principal and interest. So a tax increase or additional revenue doesn't necessarily mean there's a increase in the debt capacity. Debt capacity is the amount that's required to fund and the ability to fund future debt. So the council, once you approve a capital spending plan, you are committing the government to pay for the debt service that's required to fund that capital spending plan. So that becomes your debt capacity, the ability to repay that. And again, bonds and commercial paper are only issued based on the outstanding capital spending plan. The only thing I'll highlight on this next section is that the last two, by state law, our budgets have to include funding to pay for principal and interest on your bonds outstanding. And also in the bond documents themselves, there is a pledge that the metropolitan government will pay the principal and interest upon the due date of its outstanding obligations. I know I went through that kind of fast, but you will get the copies of this. But I just wanted to make sure that we provided you with information on where we are and what's out there as far as our debt management profile.
Councilman Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Tom, Mr. Placide. Did I say that correctly? Thank you for being here. A couple questions, and then maybe you'll come back to me, Madam Chairman. So, Mr. Placide, you're the city's financial advisor. That's your?
That is correct.
That's your title. What's your fee and compensation?
We have a contract that we get paid based on the bonds that you issued, and it's built in our contract.
So you are paid by the issuance of bonds, also commercial paper, any paper that the city issues?
That's correct.
And what percentage is that?
It varies. It's a scale based on the size of the issuer and the complexity. And if we assist you with preparation of bonds, we do planning and other things that.
Can you speak into your microphone?
I'm sorry. We assist your financial staff with other operations, such as assisting them in doing financial planning, also providing debt service schedules and giving them some indication of capacity.
So how much money do you make being the financial advisor to Metro Nashville?
It depends on the number of bonds that are issued and the size.
We'll say last year or the year before.
I can't recall exactly. I certainly can get that tip for you if need be, but I can't recall.
But I'm going to need you. Can you look at me? Just hold it right here.
Okay,
yes.
Sure. I'm sorry, Councilman Cooper, I can't tell you exactly the amount. I'd have to go back and look at my records in terms of the number of bonds that were sold, but we get compensated on the work that we do with respect to bond issues and commercial paper.
Tom, can I rely on you to provide that information for me? Thank you. Moving along a little bit, debt service in our budget, $291 million. What will it be in 2020? Now, you showed only $267 million in debt service
That's
here.
principal and interest.
But in our budget book,
Right.
It's a materially higher number. And I was promised by Chris that this would be part of this presentation today, is our 2020 and 2021 debt service forecast. No, that's a different number.
No.
See, that's just bonds. I'm talking about everything we have to pay. And you are compensated, Wayne, for our commercial paper issuances also, right?
That's correct.
That's correct. So I want you to be able to address the whole space, both bonds and paper.
Actually, Wayne, they don't get paid for commercial paper issues.
Okay.
They get paid for helping us set up the programs, but not for the individual issues of
Okay,
commercial paper.
so a fee for service as opposed to a percentage.
Right.
Okay.
But let me just touch base and maybe a little bit here on what you're seeing here is principal and interest only.
Exactly.
So when you see the total debt service number, it's going to include commercial paper interest, it's going to include.
Exactly. That's why. And as this council is grappling with funding this year as well as next year, we need a good debt service number for next year too, right? Because we really can't look out. Now, the initial number provided to me some weeks ago was materially higher than the $291 million, and that, I believe, is possibly due to keeping the commercial paper longer and not bonding that out. So, all right, let's just keep making a list. The full debt service for 20, and hey, let's go crazy, let's go to 21, because we're going to have to know with that.
Crazy, Councilman Cooper?
Crazy, Councilman Cooper. Now, Wayne, you pointed out quite correctly, Nashville is difficult to analyze as a metropolitan government. But historically, when we have used our above-average rankings by Moody's in terms of debt, people said that does not really count because these other places have more debt too. As our financial advisor, wouldn't you want to calculate for us our accurate per capita debt and compare that to peer cities' accurate per capita debt taking into effect that they have other issuing debt capacities for those other cities? So could I depend on you to do that? I mean, this is, now, the finance staff's very hardworking, but this is why you have a financial advisor with lots of resources and expertise, right? To do a true apples-to-apples debt comparison between Nashville and our relevant peer cities.
We can do that, but again, a peer city that does not have the same responsibility.
Well, you've got to go to those cities, and you've got to see if they're issuing paper out of housing, out of schools, out of roads. You've got to go figure out all the other services that they're providing too. You can do apples to apples, but it would take some work. But this is why you're being paid.
Yeah, we can certainly endeavor to do that.
Rather than to create to circulate, because you kind of have circulated a discredited analysis, right? This does not apply to us, but look at our position in the middle. Well, let's do an accurate analysis, right? That is apples to apples. All right, the backlog, $1.6 billion. Tom, you were noting in the sense of it's authorized, appropriated, not spent. I appreciate you calculating that so carefully. Does that include the commercial paper? So is it $1.6 billion or $1 billion?
The authorization is $1.6 billion. The financing of that is commercial paper and bonds.
Okay, well, are we $600 million into that so that we've got a $1 billion backlog or a $1.6 billion backlog?
$1 billion backlog.
We have a $1 billion
We've already
backlog.
spent $600 million.
And as soon as we do that $750 million bond offering, then you will move that down.
Correct.
Okay. Cash reserves, or fund balance. Okay, now this is another difficult thing coming up before this council in just a few weeks. We have to resupply our funds with cash because famously they've been drawn down. What's the right number? I'm talking to our Moody's expert, peer city financial advisor. What's the right number of cash?
You have a policy that you set that you're.
But we're not following it. We are below 5%.
Well, that's a concern. I mean, as I mentioned before, one of the things that the rating agencies look at is your rating and your outlook. If you have a policy of a fund balance of 5% and you drop below that,
Which we are.
that would be viewed by the rating agencies as what is called a rating negative.
Right.
In that you've deviated the criteria that they use, you've declined from where you were based on recent action, and that would be viewed as a rating negative.
Okay. But in our peer city comparison, this is why I think it's important for somebody to do an accurate apples to apples measure. What is the right liquidity number for a city such as Nashville, Tennessee? I mean, we developed a 5% policy. We've not followed it lately. Back in the Boner administration to respond to a financial crisis in the late 1980s. Well, was that the right number? Should it be a different number? In business, you do days cash on hand, so to speak. Is what's the equivalent?
When we've talked to the rating agencies,
Yeah.
the 5% is probably on the low end of a AA rated city. And we have been able to overcome that with the strong management, the other things. So from the feedback that we've gotten, a 5% fund balance compared to other AAA cities is on the low side.
Okay.
And I mean a AA, not AAA.
And we're currently 2.
The projection that's in the budget ordinance for the end of 2018.
End of next year is below 5.
Well, it's the same as 2018 and 2019 because the way the budget ordinance works, you assume that that fiscal 19, if it came exactly on budget, that's kind of the way this is looked at. But the general fund percentage is 4% for GSD, 4% for USD as well.
We're below it, but even if we were on it, that would be low. We're peer cities. Okay. OPEB. Again, as our financial advisor, I'm so grateful that you're here. I get asked this all the time. What are other cities doing about OPEB? Is there best practices? Could you send us something? What are our peer cities doing? I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar problem.
Most cities are taking action to reduce it going forward. That's been the more common action that's taken by major cities. Very few cities I'm aware of that have actually issued debt to try and fund it or reduce it. The most common action taken by major cities is to take steps to reduce the growth of OPEB in the future. That's the most common action that's been taken by most major cities.
Okay. Well, if you could provide just a list of what other cities are doing, I think that would be enormously helpful to the city going forward. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'll speed up to two more questions.
You're fine.
Rate change delay, been a long time since we've issued bonds. You were saying, Tom, 2015, now we've got a balance of $700 million. Rates have gone up. Okay, so 1% change, which has happened in that period of time. I mean, by having artificially low commercial paper rates, but then accepting an increase in your bonded rates, would you walk through the business implications for the city of our delay?
Maybe I can speak to that.
I mean, a year ago, wouldn't we have issued paper at a materially lower interest rate than what we would expect to be right now, on the order of how many basis points?
Probably at least 50 basis points, probably, at least.
At least 50 basis
Yeah.
points? Okay.
Okay, most major cities, such as yourself, that have ongoing major capital improvement program have found commercial paper to be a really cost-effective way to fund multiple-year capital improvement programs. And the reason being is this. If you issue bonds up front, you issue $600 million in bonds, it take you a long time to spend it. So you're incurring the cost of that debt before you actually need it.
I'm actually talking about something slightly different. Why not go ahead and bond out the $400 million or the $450 million last year when it was due, as opposed to now waiting to bond out $750 million now that it's a point higher? I mean, it's a point higher in treasuries. It may not have trickled down to the municipal. And then what's the cost implication of waiting and grabbing the artificially low, feel good for 1 year commercial paper rate, right?
And we'll get that number for you, what the weighting is, and I don't have a
Okay,
exact
let's add that
answer.
to the list. That'd be super. One last quick question, Madam Chairman.
You're fine,
Why
because
no
I think
principal
we all need to know.
repayment on the convention center loan? I mean,
I'm sorry?
why essentially no principal repayment on the convention center loan? I mean, was it issued interest only for this long a period of time?
It was issued interest only for a significant period of time, or a longer period of time, and some of that was to take advantage of the Build America bonds that were issued, which have the subsidy that comes into it. But it was also set up that way to get the convention center, get the revenue sources coming in that allowed for the repayment. And there is now a reserve there for the convention center that, it's built up. So
When you say reserve, cash balance.
Cash balance.
Right.
Yes.
You know what the cash balance is there?
Kim may know, I don't know.
Okay, that'd be great.
It's on, Kim.
I would have to look up to see how much is in the surplus revenue fund, but we can get you that.
Okay, if you had that, again, my CAFR is going to be a year out of date, so that would be terrific. Again, I know there are other people anxiously waiting, and I appreciate the time. I'm going to have other questions, too. Thanks.
Great questions, Councilman Cooper. Councilman Glover.
Thank you, Chair. So, all right, so the OPEB, when are we required, because I thought there was a federal regulation that said we're required to include it in our overall debt obligation. Has that kicked in yet, or am I misunderstanding?
Was that OPEB? Is that
Yeah.
what you- There's no requirement to include in your debt. There is requirement to report it in the CAFR, and I'll let Kim address that.
Okay.
Yeah, similar to the way the pension reporting changed about 3 years ago, starting with, I believe this year, June of 2019, that OPEB liability is going to be reflected differently in the combined statements, in the combined statement of net assets, and we will see that a pretty good increase in that liability in the combined statement of net assets this year.
Okay, and so we will start reporting that this coming June or a year from June?
Effective June 2018.
Okay, that's what I thought it was. All right, and there's not many more questions I can ask behind Councilman Cooper. I thought he did a thorough job of asking and understanding where our debt situation is. I want to go back to the convention center. Well, actually, I want to cover 2 more points. I want to go back to the convention center. Will there ever be a time if we have a cash surplus that some taxes on hotel taxes, et cetera, can be lowered, that is set aside exclusively to pay that debt service on Music City Center? Is that ever an opportunity or a possibility?
From my understanding of the reserve fund, it can be used for any legitimate purpose. And I might turn that back over to Jeff if he has specific requirements. But I believe it can be used for legitimate purposes of the authority. Is that right, Jeff?
We'll have our bond counsel come up.
That's correct. And actually, for the convention center bonds, there actually is a debt service reserve fund equal to about $30 million that's set aside in a reserve that can only be used to pay debt service. But then there is the surplus fund after debt service and operating expenses have been paid is a catch-all and can be used for any legal convention center purpose.
Okay, but it has to be held exclusively for the convention center. It could not be used for anything else.
It's got to be, the Convention Center Authority was set up under Title 767. I think I've got that right, or 789, sorry. It's got to be a legal 789 purpose.
Okay,
Yeah.
All right.
Not general government.
So then what I want, all right, so let me rephrase the question and see if I can be a little more clear with what I'm asking. We look at the reports every month, every quarter when it's showing, how great we're doing over there with revenues, et cetera. We've now built up the reserve fund pretty nicely in that arena. But the city, on the other hand, is suffering in our reserve funds and the amount of debt we have. Is there ever an opportunity with some of the taxes that are collected via the hotel taxes, et cetera, that are utilized for the Music City Center, that number could be reduced and reassigned to other areas, or is that not even a possibility going forward?
I believe, I need to confirm this with legal, but I believe when that debt is paid off, some of the taxes go away by state law.
But I think the point is, can we use it before that? And Jeff's stepping up to the counter again, or to the podium again.
I think I already know the answer. I don't think I'm going to like it, but
I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
Yeah, so your flexibility to deal with convention center dollars, you don't have any flexibility as they come in. You've told bondholders, you've got this tax rate and you've got it as long as the bonds are outstanding. What you can do, more flexibility maybe to deal with what comes out at the bottom, the surplus in any given year, but you can't reduce the rate or divert the rate until those bonds are paid.
Okay. And then one final question. As you well know, I've been looking at pensions hard and heavy. And I got the contracts this afternoon. We've scoured through them very quickly. We've read some numbers, et cetera. The thing that I'm concerned greatly about is the 103 basis points in overall cost that we're paying for fees, and maybe even a little higher when we look at what the pension board receives in fees or in cost. And in reading the contract and trying to understand why are we paying 103 basis points on that amount of money, a little below $3 billion. I mean, everybody, their jaw just trying to hit the ground when I talk to him about that, because that seems rather excessive. So I don't really know if this is the proper, but since you brought the pension slide into play here, I thought I would go ahead and ask the question, because it's excessive, in my opinion. And in reading the contract, I certainly can't understand where the fees are coming to. I see a dollar amount that's listed in there. I see an exhibit with some blanks, but I can't make it add up to come up to on just under $3 billion in assets of over $39 million in fees that we paid. Well, we're almost to the end of this year, but last year at the end of the reporting period.
I'm not sure which contracts you're talking about, but those.
It's with Mellon and with NEPD. I think was the other. Yeah.
Most of the fees that you're talking about, the 39 million, and I have to get, I'm talking off the top of my head now.
Sure.
Because I have these questions, but most of the fees that you're looking at are investment management fees.
Mm-hmm.
Those two contracts, one is for the custodian of
Right.
our assets, and one is for advisory services. Those are not going to be the $39 million fees that you're looking at. Those fees are associated with the actual investments of the funds, and we have over 100, 109, 110 different managers of our pension funds. So those are their fees. It's not going to be related to the contracts, that you're looking at. That's going to be a small piece of it.
I still will say this. I still believe they're excessive on that amount of money. And so when we're looking at potential savings and how do we save money, that's one area that I would like to see further, proof of why are we paying what, again, I consider to be an excessive amount for that large of an investment pool. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you for indulging.
Thank you so much, Councilman. Councilman Prodmore.
That was quick. Thank you, Madam Chair. And in response or follow-up with Councilman Cooper's question, I'm not trying to answer my colleague's question. I'm trying to, now I want to know the answer because I think I thought I knew the answer. So I want to make sure that, going back to the commercial paper, one of the benefits of commercial paper, as you said, is the lower interest rate. But it doesn't, at the end of 1 year, that interest rate is not going to equal where it should be. We should turn it over to initial bond. That may take, for that percentage rate to get to where the rate of a bond would be, maybe, just for argument, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. So that really frees up the commercial paper frees up some money at a lower interest rate. Is that right? The way it was sounding, it was sounding like in 1 year, why should we do it in 1 year for commercial paper, and then the next year when the bond rate will be a percentage higher or whatever, then jump over to that. But we're talking about the percentage rate will actually, for the commercial paper, may take years that you have accessibility to that money, and then yet before you have to turn it over to a bond.
Let me try it this way. We have a $700 million commercial paper program. We can borrow up to that amount, and we're currently, for the last year, we've paid anywhere from 80 basis points, less than 1%, to right at 2%. It's been averaging around 1.5%. Councilman Cooper's question was, at some point, that's going to be turned into long-term bonds. If a year ago we issued bonds for, say, $400 million instead of taking it out for commercial paper, those commercial papers already been spent. We're paying the interest on it. But for the next 20 years, we're going to pay a higher rate on the bonds. So if I'm understanding correctly, his question was, what's the benefit of paying the lower interest rate for a year on that $400 million compared to a half a basis point maybe for the next 30 years if we bonded that out last year? I think I'm stating the question correctly.
But
so it's the the interest that we pay on commercial paper is always going to be less. If it's not, we've got bigger issues, but it's always going to be less than the long-term debt, long-term interest rate, because it's short-term variable rate debt. So it's always going to be less. But if I understand, and I think I understand the question, it's at what point is keeping that shorter term, lower rate for a period of time more cost effective than issuing the bonds earlier and taking advantage of maybe 50 basis points less this year than next year for the next 20 years. So the commercial paper is always going to be less, and this year it's about 2% less than the cost of the bonds.
Which 2% can equal to quite a bit of savings. So.
But then if you take that out over the next 30 years
Right.
of bonds, then, where's that breaking
But
point?
then you're speculating that the bond increase, the bond interest will be higher 30 years from now.
There's never a known on the bond
There-
rates.
yeah.
So we don't, this time last year, we didn't know if it was going to be 50 basis points more or 25 basis points less. We try not to time the market. I mean, that's not what we're doing. We're trying to manage it at the best we can. But the question was a valid question, and we'll.
Well, I understand. I'm just glad it was answered by you this way, because that's the way I felt. I've always believed it to be, and I was afraid all this time I was thinking
you're
that we weren't taking advantage of a shorter interest rate. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Council Lady Allen. Wait a minute, 1 second. There you go.
There you go. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for this good explanation. It's always helpful to run through this stuff. I kind of wrote some questions that following through the presentation, so they're not relevant to where we are right now, but they're in order of where they came up. First of all, you mentioned the non-taxable revenue pledges that we've made to certain things that we've done, and you mentioned a specific number. Is that a number that we actually paid this year? I mean, are we making those pledges just because we need the collateral, if you will, but we never use it, or do we actually end up paying a lot of that every year?
We have never used the non-tax revenue. It was built as a security for the pledge, and we have not used non-tax revenues to make any of those interest payments.
Right, so that's just potential money to pay there, but we've never used it. Thank you, that's helpful to know. Then you talked about our ratings, which I'm glad to know we're AA, which is cool. The competitive part of me looks at other cities and goes, they're AAA, why aren't we? What would it take to get us back up to AAA?
Number one, 10 to 15% fund balance.
Ooh, not just 5.
Not just 5. Five is on the lower end of a AA. A very strong economic base. And if you look in Tennessee, I believe that Germantown and Brentwood are the AAA cities in Tennessee. A very strong revenue stream, probably lower debt obligations than we have.
Okay, so,
Wayne, did you say?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Generally speaking, though, AAA cities have a much larger fund balances, in some cases 15% or higher. And they tend to have lower debt as well. And generally because they're not growing as fast, there's not as many demands on their infrastructure. As a result, they're able to save money and increase their reserve. But if you're a growing city with demands on your infrastructure, demands to replace it, you have to issue debt to do that. And so you have a higher level of debt, and probably your fund balance is not the level that would be required for AAA.
gotcha, thank you, that's helpful. So the other question of that would be was if our rating were AAA, what would that be worth to us monetarily in a better interest rate? Could it help pay for itself in that way?
It's generally speaking, in today's environment, the saving would be like 10 basis points. So, on $100 million, it'd probably be like maybe $2 or $3 million. The variance between ratings generally is larger when rates are higher. like in today's market where rates are still relatively low based on historical levels, the difference is about 10 basis points. It could go up to as much as 15, but rates are low, and so it's about 10 basis points.
So it's not costing us that much at this point to be 2A. Okay.
And
That's,
I would say that within the AA category, there's 3 levels of AA, but there's not as much difference between a AA3 and a AA1 as you move from AAA to AA to single A. So inside, there's not as much of a variance.
and we're in a good place in that. Thank you. That's helpful to know. You also mentioned average debt burden. Ours is, depending on the criteria you're using, 13% or whatever. What would be, I guess, not our average debt burden, but what would you consider an average debt burden for healthy economic cities? Are we within that range?
If slide 23 shows the ratings of the cities and then their debt burden, so that might be a good place to look.
And I guess which of those cities would you consider an average or as opposed to one who's maybe a little higher up than they ought to be? I mean, is 10% something we might be aspiring to, or?
You're looking at fund balance or?
I'm subject to where your slideshow is, so I'm looking at a big question mark right now.
Okay.
Again, it was the page that came shortly after all the rating stuff. That you can, I mean, you can get that to me later. That's not that. Okay, and then final question is, again, within the criteria for our ratings being AA as opposed to AAA or whatever, I'm a little confused by the fact that the hospital support is a big factor. I mean, we have other things that our city spends money on, like parks that don't make money and schools that don't make money, that we just as a city commit to do that because that's what makes us a great city. Why is the hospital support considered a deficit when schools and parks are not?
We've actually responded, and these are taken from the rating agency's comments. And for the last 7 to 8 years, they've had 3 things that they've asked us about every year. One is the hospital authority, one is our fund balance, and one is the passage of the limitation on the debt. I mean, the
Tax rate.
Tax rate. Those are the 3 things that they ask about every year. And when we were in the years where we were cutting the general hospital commitment, it was reduced, and their comments, if you look back over time, are pleased with that. And to go to that, I can't say specifically why they picked that versus anything else, but that was something that they've asked us about every year for probably the last 8 years.
Okay.
I would add to that that's been a topic of discussion, and generally whenever we have a rating meetings, that's the hospital generally is part of that discussion, as Tom mentioned, and so that it's pretty important. It's something on their radar screen, and they're concerned about it, and certainly want to see what action has been taken with respect to that.
And I think that it may be more of a national issue that public hospitals have seen a increase in attention across the country, and that may be one of the reasons as well. But I just know that we respond to their questions on those every time.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm out of questions.
Thank you, Council Lady Allen. Council Lady Henderson.
Thank you, Chair Vercher. My questions are about, several of them have already been answered, so I think remaining would be about OPEB, which for the viewing public is other post-employment benefits. I think sometimes in budget and finance, we throw around a lot of acronyms, and I think the budget is very concerning to our constituents this year, so I did want to mention that so people would know what we were talking about. I guess my question is, and one other suggestion I would have for you, I appreciate the slide presentation, but if we could receive that kind of immediately prior to you giving this presentation, so that, I mean, like Council Lady Allen, taking copious notes, but to be able to refer specifically to the graphs and charts because I think sometimes a lot of our questions are going to be going back because I can't recall what, it was at a particular point. I found myself taking a lot of photographs of, of the slide screen. But as it relates to OPEB presently, how much then are we applying to that, or what is our annual obligation on that now?
It's a pay-as-you, we'll have to get, I don't know what that is.
Ms. On Kim?
I wish I had brought the CAFR in here. It's in the CAFR, but I can get that amount to you.
Okay, or just what page it's on in the CAFR, or, if you could
Sure, sure.
Does anybody have kind of a ballpark on that, just for discussion purposes? I mean, I'm not going to hold you to a precise number, or was it not? I mean, I guess you had it as a.
We can see what we pay in what's in the fiscal 19 budget for the general fund as an example.
That would be great. Thank you.
For the GSD general fund, if I can find it. In the GSD general fund for fiscal 19, we have 54 million budgeted, and that basically represents the premiums paid for retirees out of the GSD. And if I can flip to the page. Okay, in the USD, that number is 4.5 million. So that's how much we pay on a pay-as-you-go basis. If we were fully funding the current year liability, I want to say that might be in the neighborhood of 150 million. So that difference is what gets recorded as, Councilman Cooper's nodding. He's probably found it. Okay, he's probably found it in the CAFR. But that difference is what gets recorded as an additional liability in the statement of net assets currently.
Okay, I appreciate that. So again, just for the viewing public, post-employment benefits would be health care, anything beyond that. This is separate from the pension amount that people are receiving, but is the benefits piece. So health care, anything else?
Dental and health care is the vast majority of it, but there's also a dental component.
Okay, health, dental, nothing else, no
I
kind of
don't think
life.
so. There may be a small component that's a small life insurance. But
Did we have that as a benefit some point in the past, but then we sunsetted that or something, or?
I believe retirees get some kind of a small death benefit that there's a premium on. I'll double check and get that for you.
Okay, I appreciate that. And then, Mr. Placide, you said the way that most large municipal governments were dealing with this kind of out of balance and looming obligation was just to start now going forward to no longer have this benefit.
I think the observation that we made with respect to other large cities is that they're taking steps to reduce that benefit going forward. I don't think anyone.
Okay, so not to eliminate the benefit, but to just reduce
the level of benefit or reduce the eligibility or the program, but not to completely eliminate it.
And so what currently is, I guess, the level of our benefit or percentage, or does that vary depending upon the employee based on when they were employed, et cetera? I mean, typically, if you say you are a Metro pensioner and you have this benefit, I mean, does that just vary, or that is just, so we say if we're looking at changing that, I mean, what are...
Actually, there was the Study and Formulating Committee that met 2 years ago, I believe.
Indeed, right.
And actually made some recommendations. A couple of them were actually adopted that reduced future liabilities. And those are the kind of things, these were small. I think there were some tiered premiums.
Okay.
And so there were a few things, small tweaks that were made those are the kind of things that he's talking about as far as changing future liabilities or adjusting those, how the benefits are determined going forward, so.
And was there any projection made with those suggestions? I mean, I know at the point, I read that report at the time.
I believe our actuary did make some some projections, but I don't know what they are.
Yeah, and we can get HR to provide that information, those study and formulating recommendations and what was adopted and the numbers behind those.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Thank you, Council Lady. Council Lady Hurd.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I'm almost like you need to be an economist or a lawyer or both to be able to decipher from the presentation all that information that we received. I had some similar concerns like Council Lady Allen with the Metro General, because I know you were talking about the hospital and how it was a problem when it came to the ratings and all of that, and it was one of the challenges that you had listed. And I also had a question in regards to the pension, because you said that we were paying a higher ratio than 96% of our peer cities, and I'm wondering, why are we doing that when we can't fund it?
No, that actually is our funded position of our pension plan is 96% of our liabilities on an actuarial basis. So that means looking out over the life of the pension plan, our liabilities for all of those payments, we have 96% of that funded based on our actuarial assumptions. So that's a very strong position, not a weak position.
Right. It is. I gathered that it was a very strong position, but what I'm saying is that are we having trouble with that now with our current budget in terms of being able to continue to pay into the pension? We do not?
Our pension is actuarially funded and always has been.
Okay. Well, this is my concern, because I was taking these notes and I heard strong economy, increasing, unemployment decreasing, rising, growth, tremendous trend on building permits, paying off debt. So I'm concerned of why are we having a problem paying the raises that we promised in the budget for this coming up year? And if we having trouble paying it, why didn't we foresee that last year? So why did we commit to paying those raises? It was something also in there about the responsibility of oversight. So I'm just trying to figure out what's going on, what's wrong, what went wrong that we are in this predicament that we're in right now. And I'm getting hundreds of emails because people are saying that we're getting all of this money in and all of these words are being used, that things are increasing, unemployment is decreasing, we've got growth. We are doing better than our peer cities and all of that, but we can't meet a commitment that we made last year.
Do y'all want to briefly answer that? I know we're talking about debt. Can you talk about the revenue side of it for Council Lady Hurd?
Well, if debt comes, if you don't have enough revenue to pay for the expenses, I mean,
Now,
they don't go together?
No. Our debt that we're talking about is to fund capital projects and the debt that's issued to fund those projects. So it's an operating issue in the fact that the operating budget pays the debt service, but that's not the debt that we're talking about related to this.
Okay, so I know we were talking about the commercial paper and all that, and I think we said that we've issued too much debt or something to that effect when we were investing in all of these projects that we have going on. And we have to, is that correct? Please help me, I mean, because I need to understand, I want to understand.
I hope I didn't say we've issued too much debt, because that's not for me to say.
Well, that was my understanding of what was said.
What we're doing is we're issuing debt and commercial paper to pay for the projects that have been approved and approved by the council, by the administration, by whoever else, not whoever else, I mean, approved by the council. There's, if you remember the number, there's $3+ billion of projects, capital projects that have been approved. What we're doing is financing those projects as the money's spent. So that's what we're talking about here, not debt against the general government operations. We're talking about capital expenditures.
Okay, maybe you can answer the question, because it seems like it's all going together, being that we can't get the raises that we promised, so. And I understand that it may be two separate things, but if.
Go ahead.
Again, it gets back to operational versus capital. But the question you're asking about as far as paying raises gets back to the whole issue of budget estimates versus what actual performance was. And we got hit with two things. One is the reappraisal. The appeals of those assessed values were greater than we had allowed for in the estimation of the certified tax rate. So we lost money there. The second big problem or issue with property taxes was overestimating public utility revenue from that source. And those are your two primary things that are going to fund pay raises and the operational aspects of the government. And then the third thing that's a big issue this year is the unavailability of fund balance to help offset some of these lost revenues. That's why we need to rebuild fund balance.
Now, that's where I think all of this comes in with the fund balance, because that's what makes sense to me in terms of the debt that we are paying, and we are not able to save the money to increase the fund balance like some of our surrounding counties are, as you said, with Germantown and Brentwood, because they are not growing as fast and they're able to save, and they increase that fund balance up to 15 and higher %. Correct?
Exactly, in terms of, I mean, you have the same issue in debt with fund balance. You want it to be strong enough to cover years like this. By the same token, in the operational side, you need to build your fund balance so you've got it there in the event that revenues do come in less than what were projected.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the education.
Thank you, Council Lady Hurd. Councilman Cooper.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate you coming back around to me. A couple of quick questions.
No, this is important, Councilman.
Well, if you didn't mind, Tom, if you could go back in your slideshow, you had a really elegant, you had it last year too, slide of out-year debt service payments peaking in 2024 and 2025. It was late in your presentation.
Slide 60.
Those are the numbers. This is a graph.
The next slide.
Oh, graph.
Yeah, great. Okay, if you could just put a little bit of language here, and I think to some degree this may get directly to Council Lady Hurt's question. In 2019, that number looks like 275. Is that your bonded and interest? That's not the 291.
No, actually, this answers one of your questions you had before on the budget.
Thanks.
If you look at the FY9 or 6/30/19, the debt service is
Can you use I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. At FY19, at the end of the year, it's 279 million. So if you remember, the other slide was 267 for the current year's debt service.
Well, I'm sorry, so is this fiscal year 2019?
It is, it is.
Okay, well, now in our budget book, that's 291 for debt service. So you're just doing bonded interest?
This is bonded.
This is 100% bonded?
Bonded principal and interest.
Okay.
That's all this is.
Okay.
So it goes from 279 in 19 to 380 million in 2024.
Okay, I think you have to take this bonded chart, beautifully done, but I think you have to add in our other sources of debt service payments that we expect to have going forward so that we can model this. So, and then to foot it back to the 291, so to speak, the actual debt service that we're going to have to find cash. Because if your bonded number is here going up to about 360 and 222.
380 in 2025.
380. Well, a couple of favors. One was to put actual numbers with this so I don't have to guess with the bars.
It's actually on the preceding page. You'll be able to see.
Okay, with the bars. Secondly, since you've got a big jump up in bonded and principal with the expected issuance coming off the commercial paper, really not, and that this is just existing, right? This is not any.
This includes the next 3 bond issues to fund the 1.6 billion.
And then, okay, so, but the sources of that, then, are we drawing down our backlog? Is this including the backlog? The backlog is authorized and appropriated.
This funds the total backlog of 1.6 billion.
So this funds the backlog.
Right.
But does it have any projected new capital spending?
No.
Okay. So with 0 new capital spending.
Correct.
Okay. And then you could, and this, I'm sorry, just, this has the backlog in it, but not the new bonding.
Well, this is
With the new bonding. Okay. Okay. All right. That, fantastic. Be really grateful. I think that's what every councilman should have in their desk. Okay. Second question. Going back over the history of commercial paper, when you look at the CAFR and the footnote, the commercial paper program grows. It's kind of invented, like in 2011. You know, everybody's very excited about it.
It actually started in 2003.
In 3, but nobody used it.
Nobody used it
much.
It's grown since 2000.
Okay, but in 2011, it's like $50 million, and then it goes to $100 million, and then it's a couple $100 million, and then a couple of years ago.
Strictly based on timing of when the bonds are issued and the use of commercial paper. We haven't intentionally reduced or not. It funds actual expenditures of capital.
What was the average balance of commercial paper, say, 5 years ago?
I'd have
on that year, because that would be very interesting, because you go through this and it adds every year to what is a significant percentage of your overall indebtedness.
I can tell you, last year when I did this presentation, the average monthly spending was a little over 25 million a month.
Okay, and we've hiked that now up to 33.
Over 39 million a
Okay.
month. And that's spending, commercial paper is only a byproduct of the expenditure of authorized capital projects.
Well, I'm wondering around to a little bit of different question with our financial advisor here, taking advantage of his time. The trade-off between interest rate risk between commercial paper, of course, gets bigger when the balance of it goes up to where now our commercial paper is a material percentage of our overall indebtedness. I believe much larger than it used to be, but we could go back and do the historical research on that. So you're accepting an interest rate risk. 50 basis points on $500 million over 30 years is $75 million more in interest that you would be charged in the life of that. So by not financing it out, you're accepting that risk. We have a hedge plan for fuel, which can't be more than saving us a few $100,000, right? Is there any hedge strategy that people like yourself advocate for cities that have significant interest rate risk that you're aware of, Wayne? I mean, in my own business, I do a certain amount of interest rate hedging. The banks require it.
As I mentioned earlier, most larger cities that have continuous large CIPs, they use the commercial paper to fund the programs because at any point in time, a certain percentage of their funds will be in commercial paper.
Right.
So it sort of averaged down your cost of funds if you look at it that way.
Well, but there are rules of thumb about why you don't do 100% with it, because sooner or later you're accepting a big interest rate risk. My question is there a hedging strategy to push off some of the interest rate risk that you're inevitably accepting by keeping a high short-term balance paper?
I'm not aware of any clients that do that. I mean, you generally, you're saying that over the next 10 years, I'm going to spend a large amount of money. At any point in time, I will have a certain percentage of my outstanding debt will be commercial paper, which will be at a lower rate. So I'm sort of lowering my average cost of funds at any point in time. And you kind of, you don't know, as was mentioned earlier, rates have been fairly low historically for the last 8 years. And so that hasn't been a real concern.
Okay. We're not quite connecting on this. There's not a bank in the United States that would not require a hedge strategy on this amount of short-term borrowing. So I just didn't know if cities had picked up that strategy or not. And you're saying probably not.
Most cities that I know are large cities that have extensive commercial paper programs, and some of them, like $1 billion or 800. I have clients who have that size. They typically do not hedge. They just say, over the next 10 years, a certain percentage of my dollars will be in commercial paper, which lowers my overall cost of funds.
Once again, fantastic. Thank you. What is that number? What are best practices from other cities? If you would look that up, just as you said, that's great. You're invaluable, and I appreciate your national expertise in guiding us with what an appropriate balance should be. That being said, thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Wayne.
Not a problem, Councilman. Councilman Glover.
Thank you, Chair. I knew there was one question I was forgetting, and I think this is very relevant because I want to say it was November or October of 2016. We basically took a position we were going to move away from negotiated bonds to competitive bonding. Now, I'm not a bond guy. I do other things. And certainly Councilman Cooper understands the bonds better than I could on that. But it is my understanding that negotiated bonds, we typically may pay a higher rate, interest rate, than we would necessarily with competitive bonds. And so could I get you to explain the difference? And if, in fact, we took a different philosophy of saying we're going to move from negotiated bonds, and I can bring the newspaper article when it was reported a year and a half, 2 years ago, and said we're going to a competitive stance on that. Why, when we talked about the Sports Authority issuing bonds, does it have specific language inside of it that we will issue them under a negotiated clause versus competitive clause?
Well, let me take a quick shot at it, and then Wayne can fill in. On the negotiated sale, and there's varying views over whether one's cheaper or not. I mean, I think Wayne will attest to that, but there's the idea of a negotiated sale on something that's not, and I'm going to use the term vanilla bonds, is to get an interest in the bonds from potential buyers. And when you do something like a sports facility, when we did our green bonds for the water department, those lend themselves to negotiated deals where you are telling your story to the buyers in more than just putting out, we're selling bonds, can you come buy it? That's the main difference between negotiated and competitive sales. And again, there's varying analysis over whether one is cheaper than the other. And to do an actual comparison, you would have to have a bonds issuing on the same day, same term, same ratings, everything, because the market changes every day. So to get an apples to apples, you would have to literally have a side-by-side comparison. But I think it's true what I said. The negotiated gives you the ability to tell your story, to tell what the bonds are, to generate buyers for those bonds in a more aggressive way.
Okay, well, and again, I don't live in the bond world, I live in the investment world. And so, but it seemed to be a real big deal about 18, 19 months ago. I mean, it made the paper and everything else. So that's why I'm just wondering why we went back to putting the language after we specifically said we want to move to a competitive stance versus a negotiated stance.
Actually, what happened, the state, and I don't remember the dates, Jeff may know them better than I do, but at some point the state authorized the governments to issue negotiated debt, and that sunset at some point, and I'm not sure the dates, but we can no longer issue negotiated deals on standard GO new issue money. So that went away. We don't even have that option anymore. The preference is still, and since 2006, I mean, I don't know what the date is, but the stated preference is competitive bid on all of them. But given that, on the water and sewer deal we just did, it was determined that negotiated was the best method to get our story out there, even though our preference was competitive bidding.
Okay, and I'll close with this, Chair, because I think I'm trying to understand what the cost differentials would be. Why, and I'll ask this to finance more than you guys, why would we put in a potential resolution to issue bonds by the Sports Authority under a negotiated term versus negotiated or competitive? And I'm saying this because so many times you guys walk back in here and say, well, the council voted for this. You approved all of this. And so I'm trying to understand why we would box ourselves into saying and negotiated, because once it's in that resolution, that's all you guys have to do when you take it forward. You don't have to look at a competitive to determine what's going to be better for the citizens or the taxpayers of Nashville. You're going to do it the way that we've approved it, unless you can prove us wrong sitting out here. But I don't have enough fingers to count on my hands the number of times I've heard you guys come back in here and say, well, the council approved these things. So I'm just trying to make sure on this, because it's my understanding with the limited research and limited knowledge I have in this arena that you literally could be talking about millions and millions of dollars in interest difference over a 20, 30-year lifespan of these loans.
I'd just like to address that question if I could.
Okay.
There's no empirical data that shows that one method of sale is substantially cheaper than the other. The factors that come into play in terms of deciding what method of sale is the complexity of the bond sale, if it's a new credit that's new to the market, also the volatility in the market. One of the things that's advantage of a negotiated sale, you can time the time in which you hit the market, which is really critical. If for any reason the market rates are the volatility, you can delay your sale and wait until a time when the market is more stable. Competitive sale, you set the sale date like weeks in advance, and you're locked into that. The other thing that it does to you is you have people, when you do a negotiated sale, you can market the bonds directly to the underwriters market the bonds directly to potential buyers, which helps in terms of distribution and the acceptance of those bonds. So the other reason why negotiated sale was used on a number of deals was we were doing what is called refunding, which we can't do anymore because of the tax change. But refunding bonds are structured in a way to achieve saving for Metro Nashville. And we can structure those savings by doing a negotiating sale. It's something that you can't do as readily doing a competitive sale. So generally, if we've done a negotiated sale, it's been one, it's a new credit like the convention center, a complicated credit like the Sports Authority, or it's a volatile market, and we're trying to address that. And generally, those are the reasons why a negotiated sale is used.
Okay, so did I hear you correctly saying we can no longer do refunding on the bonds?
You can advance refundings, you can do current refundings, but you can't, current refunding is within 90 days of the call date. Anytime beyond that, you can't do that unless you do it taxable.
Okay, and I think if I remember correctly, we've locked into a number of 3.5% I think if I remember.
3.5% for savings.
Yeah, 3.5% for savings. Okay, thank you, Chair. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Could we not put both the language in there of negotiated and/or competitive? Is there some legal reason that's not an option?
Jeff, do you want to?
No reason you couldn't do that.
Okay. Well, I want us to go back and revisit that because I think it's going to to me, until I get comfortable with some things, I think that we need to make sure we don't close any doors on potentially saving money for taxpayers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilman. I have a quick question. On the negotiated, is there a minimum number that we market to, or on the negotiated, is it us saying there's someone that we know fit the criteria and that's the person that we're marketing it to? I'm trying to choose my words carefully, and not to imply that we're negotiating with someone in advance and other entities don't have an opportunity.
No, actually what we mean by the negotiated is that we're setting up a team of underwriters, and it's always more than one underwriter.
That was my, thank you, yeah.
We'll go out and market to as many people as they can find.
Just wanted to put that out there in the universe. Thank you. Council Lady Henderson.
Thank you, Chair Vercher. As I look back over my notes, I just had one outstanding question, and I know it may seem minor, but you referred several times to wrapping our debt.
Okay.
And you didn't explain what that meant. It said that it's no longer best practice and we don't do it anymore, but could you speak to what it is and why we did it?
So if you have debt service that is non-level, so it's jumping around, what we would try to do in the past was when we issued new debt to try to fit those holes where the debt service was going up or down and level it out. So the idea of wrapping is to wrap the new debt service around outstanding debt service to make it a smooth transition. So we're not having to fund $300 million this year, $280 next year, $100 million the year after that. So the wrapping just simply meant trying to level the debt service by adjusting the way the principal and interest were going to be paid the principal was going to be paid on the new bond issue. So we're wrapping the new debt service around the old debt service to level it out.
Okay, so that would be an issue of timing and quantity, and so that would just be on your repayment schedule, you're saying?
It's leveling out your repayment schedule.
Okay.
But with the new laws that we're operating under, they introduced the term balloon debt, which means that there's more debt service paid. It limits the amount of debt service that you can pay above a previous year so that you can't push all of your debt to
the end.
To the end.
Right. And then can you speak to, though, kind of, the pattern of pushing the debt to the end that we seem to, in big projects? So you spoke to doing that for the convention center, right? And I know you want to kind of get your legs under you, start to develop some revenue and so forth. The transit plan was likewise, like all the debt was pushed to the end, so forth. I mean, I guess I just, in an effort to keep things level, because we can't now wrap and because you don't want to push it all to the end, what would you say sort of strategically we are doing to keep that debt service
Actually,
level?
it's what we're doing since the 2015 issue, and every issue since 2010 except for the 13 has been level debt service.
Okay.
And one of the things that you'll notice when you get the presentation is most of our outstanding bonds are refunding bonds. those will not appear to be level debt service if you look at the chart. But what those do, or they take, when we issue refunding bonds, it's taking out maturities of several of the previous bonds. So even though it doesn't look like it's level, it's matching maturities than bonds that are already outstanding. So if we issue refunding bonds and one of the issues as we're maturing has 10 million this year and another one has 20 million this year, all of a sudden we've got $30 million that we're issuing, and it looks like the debt service for that bond is 30 million, but it's a combination of the other two.
Okay, understood. Thank you. I appreciate that explanation. Thank you.
Thank you, Council Lady Henderson. Seeing no other council members seeking recognition, this concludes our treasurer's report update. Tom, thank you so much, and everything that you do. Thank you so much, and we are adjourned.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.